The What to Next podcast helps you build a TBR of future favorite books. In each episode, Lori and Maine interviews authors and book influencers to recommend books they loved for you to pick up today. If you're an avid reader, always looking for your next great read, then the show's for you. Hi, Luna. Welcome to What to Next podcast.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
So happy to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Luna McNamara. I live in Boston. I got my master's degree in the study of women, gender, and sexuality in world religions from Harvard, and then realized that academia was actually a dumpster fire and I didn't want to go into it. Yeah. So I went into medical research and then eventually social work. But I've always had a real love for ancient civilizations, for the ways that gender plays out in all levels of human societies throughout history. And now I use that to write my novels.
Yeah, so let's talk about your writing journey. When did you get started writing? Was it something you were always writing or something you picked up later in life and you're just like a pandemic hobby, you know?
I love that question. So my mother actually tells this story of when I was like maybe a year and a half old, like couldn't really talk yet, writing things down was a faraway dream, but like at snack time, I had two grapes that I would make talk to each other in like my little baby babble, and they would have arguments and like make up and stuff, you know, before I could really talk all that much. So I think storytelling has always been a really big part of who I am. And in terms of my writing journey, I did some writing in my teenage years, but you know, your brain is still forming, your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. So I kind of left that behind. But then in my mid to late 20s, I actually started writing fan fiction. And I realized I loved it. And I love the communities and I love the process of writing and turning this idea in your head into tens of thousands of words. And that's how my novel Psyche and Eros got its start, was as fan fiction. And during the pandemic, as I had all this time on my hands, there really wasn't much else to do. I revisited it and was like, you know, I could do a lot more with this than I have. So I focused on that, and the end result of a very up and down journey is my novel Psyche and Eros.
So we got to talk about Psyche and Eros. What is the elevator pitch?
The way I describe it is it's a little bit Madeline Miller's Circe, a little bit Disney's Hercules. You have the headstrong princess Psyche and the jaded elder god Eros brought together by a love curse, and they have to figure that out.
And so what was the process of researching, you know, mythology and like coming up with a story? You mentioned it started as a fan fiction and then it just evolved. Like, but what was that process for you?
Yeah, and you know, it was just a fun project, but like coming from an academic background, I knew I was going to make changes. I knew it was fiction and I didn't want to be completely beholden to the historical and mythological sources, but I still wanted it to be grounded in it. And I drew, like, I ended up putting some of my research skills into play. I would not call myself an expert on the myth, but I was really interested in digging into the actual source text that we get the myth from, which is The Golden Ass by Lucius Apuleius, from roughly the 2nd century of the Common Era, written at the fringes of the Roman Empire. And it is an absolutely bonkers book. It follows the journey of this young man, Lucius, who is turned into the form of an ass by these Thessalian witches, and eventually has to find his way back to human form, but not after a lot of adventures that bring him into contact with the stock characters of his day. And the story of Eros and Psyche is set into the middle of that novel. And it's actually put in the mouth of an elderly woman who serves as a cook to a group of bandits. And she's telling this story to a young woman who has been taken captive by those bandits and understandably is very upset by this. But the elderly woman is like, listen, don't worry. I know you had bad dreams. I know you're stressed, but like, things will end up all right for you. And let me tell this story to you in the meantime to show this to you. So that's the origin of the Eros and Psyche myth. And I've had the incredible privilege to correspond with some scholars who specialize in it. And the consensus seems to be that Apuleius pretty much invented the myth, but he did draw on some existing sources and traditions that are now lost to us. And there is a statue of Eros and Psyche that predates Apuleius's novel in the British Museum. So clearly there's, like many ancient authors, he really put his own spin on the story, but he was drawing from some traditions that probably existed. It's hard to say. We've lost so much ancient literature that it's really tricky to say. And let me see. So I was also interested in what the myth might have meant to Apuleius, which he was a Neoplatonist philosopher. Drawing on the philosophy of Plato, had been interpreted and reinterpreted throughout the centuries. But Apuleius seemed to really like this idea of the ascent of the soul, that for our spiritual development, we have to pass through different stages, all culminating in union, enlightenment, comprehension of the mysteries, call it what you will. And I also got really interested in modern and contemporary interpretations. And there's a number of sources about what the story of Eros and Psyche tells us about psychology, about the way women fall in love, about the way men fall in love. I'm a little skeptical of these like entrenched gender differences. I think people are more similar than they are different, but I had a lot of interest in the way that this myth had been delivered to the modern era. And in terms of other fictional sources, C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces was another inspiration as well, which in his retelling, he focuses on what the perspective of one of Psyche's sisters, which I shift around in my novel a little bit. But I looked at some contemporary scholars of Greece and Rome. One of them, Anne Carson, has written Eros the Bittersweet, which is this really incredible book about the way the personage of Eros has been described and perceived throughout the ancient world. And that actually helped me a lot with the characterization of Eros, because at first, I wasn't entirely sure what to do with him. It was much easier to relate to this young mortal woman than it was to this ancient god. But Anne Carson points out that the poet Sappho referred to Eros as glucopikron, which translated from the Greek means sweet bitter. That love is an incredible experience, but it's also very painful. And that's a theme that's very much woven into the novel, but also into the characterization of Eros as someone who is somewhat contrary, somewhat contradictory. He zigs when you think he's going to zag, and is just, you don't quite know what to expect from him. So that was a very long answer for a rather short question. I hope that's all right.
I love this idea, like, like you're pulling from different places and then forming your own story, fictionalized and like having this world, but it's sort of similar to fan fiction. There's established rules already made. And so you're actually building a world around those established rules,
Exactly. Well, arguably, this is a very old game, and a lot of the classical writers were writing fan fiction. Yeah. Homer was probably not the origin of the Iliad and Odyssey stories that we have today. He was probably getting that basic outline from somewhere else and putting his
Mhm.
own spin on it. And Euripides' Medea is a more well-documented instance of this, where the playwright Euripides in, I think, the 4th century before the Common Era in Athens, um, wrote the play that we get Medea as a child murderer from. But
Mhm.
it seemed to have really shocked his contemporaries. And there are other sources that say it wasn't Medea who killed her children. It was the Corinthians in the city where she lived, or it was an accident, or something else happened. But in Euripides' fanfic, the famous Medea, he had his own twist. And I think that's the fun thing about myth, is that it is very democratic, that people can lock into it and have their own readings of it, have their own interpretations. And it might not necessarily be what I would do with those myths, but I love seeing the creativity that people bring to it.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Thank you for sharing a little bit about the history, and thank you for sharing where myths are coming from. Because I think sometimes we think it's like it's just one text and that's what it counts to, but it's like canon. And the reality is like there's more to the story. The story was blended from multiple places, multiple ideas to form this story, and other people can reinterpret it in other ways. And we don't know what
Exactly.
canon was created. Like it wasn't done in a vacuum, even
Yeah.
though even though that's the only text that we have left over.
Exactly. And there seems to have been a lot of regional variations in myths. So,
Mhm.
like, people in Thebes might tell the story this way, but then if you go over to Sparta, they might tell it another way. And I think that diversity of opinion is really fascinating. And I definitely have bumped into this idea of a canon of myth, often from readers. But that's really an attitude that owes a lot more towards European Protestantism than
Mhm.
anything that Apuleius or Euripides or Homer would have recognized.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So let's shift things around with reading wise. What kind of books do you
Yeah.
tend to read?
Oh, I am a very omnivorous reader. I dig into all different kinds of genres. I like something with very well developed characters, something that keeps my attention from the first page. And I love good prose. I love a good twist of phrase. So one of my top picks, and I'm looking at it on the shelf behind me, but that's not going to help your listeners. The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi
Mm.
I think it's my top book of the year so far. It's about this mysterious heiress of this extremely wealthy family who is very, she has a lot of secrets, and she begins this affair and eventually ends up marrying this professor of mythology who comes with his own dark secrets from his own childhood. And they are eventually drawn back to her childhood home, where there are a lot of signs of her missing childhood friend, Azure, who disappeared without a trace around the time they graduated high school. And the novel unravels between the two perspectives of Azure and the unnamed husband as they navigate this labyrinth of mysteries in this haunted house. And it draws in mythology absolutely beautifully. Arguably, it's another retelling of the Eros and Psyche myth in certain ways, of these lovers who can't fully perceive and understand and see each other. But it is so gorgeously written. It kept me riveted until the last page, and there are some twists and turns I did not see coming, but it was one of those books that I rushed home from work early to read, which is my criteria for a good book.
Gosh, I love this recommendation. And you just have me at like another retelling, a potential retelling of Psychos and Errors. So,
Yeah, exactly. It's not, it doesn't follow the myth completely, but like if you kind of squint a little bit, you're like,
yeah,
oh, this is a
yeah,
familiar storyline.
yeah. So, Luna, tell us where we can find you online.
You can find me online at Twitter at McNamara Luna. You can find me on Instagram, Luna McNamara Writer, and my website is Luna McNamara Writer as well.
Thank you, Luna, for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to share with friends, subscribe, rate, and review the show. This is the easiest way to support the podcast. For a list of books mentioned and other book recommendations, please visit whattoreadnextblog.com. Thank you so much for listening and happy reading.